Welcome back, everybody. So I wanted to record a little bit of an intro to music. We began talking about this the other day with our guest speaker, but I want to give you a little background to go with the assignment that will be up on Schoology soon. So I showed this in class the other day. This is a picture of the oldest known instrument that we have discovered. I got the time wrong a bit in class because I had said something like 6,000 years, but actually they believe this dates back to greater than 40,000 years ago. And why I think that's particularly important, and a lot of people think this is interesting, is that's long enough that it sort of demonstrates that humans could have evolved along with music. And that's one of the things I want us to think about, is how connected we are, and maybe even at the sort of biological level, how our brains might actually be physically wired to produce and enjoy music. It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, and it lets you sort of understand how our brains work and develop in the first place. So, why do I think this might be true? And why do a lot of people? It's not really my area, I guess. So we talked about this paper a little bit as well, Tom Cheever had referenced it. But basically, scientists believe that our brain seems to have areas that respond specifically to music, different from other sounds. And in order for that to happen, our brain would have had to evolve to have done that. Or at least our brain is placing some sort of higher importance on music to have sort of allocated space for music. Right? So how do they do this? This paper, if you can see sort of up top here, they put people in a functional MRI again, right? So that's taking live images of their brain where they can see the activity as time is going on. So up here, they played them. They just show a few of them, but they played them when they were in this MRI, 165 different common sounds. And what we'll talk about later is these sounds get sort of put into different categories, even though they would be played to them at random. Some of them are just noise. Some of them are obviously sort of just talking. Some of them are normal sounds you'd hear every day. Some things are like an alarm clock, but then also things like a guitar or pop song here that are clearly music. And the authors wanted to know, are there particular regions of the brain that respond to particular types of sounds? And don't worry about the rest of this. It's a fairly complicated thing, right? There's a lot of math and computer science happening here. You're looking at tons of data to try and pick through this. But what they really were looking at, and shows sort of down here, is sort of the area of the primary auditory cortex, right? That's going to be the region that directly takes in information from our brain. And then the area around it, which can go by a few different names, which you could call it something like the secondary auditory cortex or the associated auditory cortex. But that's sort of involved in sort of the first processing of sound after it comes into the brain. Primary auditory cortex, as we'll learn pretty much sort of this week or next week, is really just going to tell you how loud sound is and what tone it is and what pitch, basically. So the other areas of the brain do the sort of more complicated processing. Right. So they're looking at these and they're looking at different areas, and they basically kind of let a computer sort of munch on all this data that they put into it, and they can see a bunch of different things. And if you're looking here, I will try and quickly explain the concept of what they do here called a principal component analysis. If anybody's ever taken any data science or potentially a lot of computer science courses, you've probably done something like this. But the main concept here is if you give a computer a whole bunch of data and then you tell it whole bunch of different inputs, and then you got all this different data out of it, it will try and categorize it by sort of the simplest means it can figure out how to. Now the computer doesn't know enough. It doesn't know what those sounds are. It doesn't know what that is. It's just sort of unbiasedly looking at this data. And you can see then it comes up with a bunch of these different components to sort it by. So it doesn't know what these components are. It just knows that for one type of sounds, basically, component 1, this area of the brain really seems active. For component 2, these two areas of the brain seem really active, right? But the interesting thing, if we look over here, is that they then take these different components and see how they rank basically by intensity in different regions for different types of sounds. If you look at this, right, so the blues sounds are basically different instrumental vocal music, then it's speech, then it's sort of other types of non-human speech, human non-vocal, mechanical, nature, environmental sounds, right? So you see, if you look at it by these first few components, they're not seeing that much different, right? The main differences between the first two were what parts of the brain. But the interesting thing here is if we look at component 5 and 6, is that basically music, particularly for 6, but also sort of 5 seems to be important for language and a little bit of music, vocal music, so that sort of makes sense. But 6 in particular here is the two blue types, right? Instrumental and vocal music, whereas everything else. So what that seems to say then, if we look here, and we go back to these pictures here, is this region, sort of right here, just along the outside of the auditory cortex and that associated auditory cortex on both sides of the brain, this seems to be a region that is specifically made to detect music. Right? So what does that mean? It means that we must, for some reason, have evolved to have this. Now, there's an alternative explanation. It's either we evolved to have it or we learned to have it, but they kind of both have to happen. You know, you can imagine somebody who maybe has never experienced music, never develops this, but the fact that we are capable of developing this means that we had to evolve some sort of ability to music. And we can talk more about that in class, but I think that's a thought to just sort of carry with you. Some reason music is so important to us that our brain has given it this little, you know, I don't even know how big this would be, but you know, it's given it sort of a cubic centimeter brain, maybe at most, maybe a little bit less, but that's a lot, right? We don't give that to just sort of, right? Driving a car, which is very important for all of us, we have no specific region for driving a car, right? We haven't evolved long enough for that. But music gets this little chunk. Another thing to keep in mind is that sort of music appreciation and performance seem to be tied together. And this sort of makes sense. And if we had more time, I always like the idea about developing a little bit more on sort of how dance fits into this. But the main thing here is that when you hear music, your body sort of naturally goes to sort of keeping the rhythm and the beat. This is something that we do without thinking. And what this is largely trying to show, and again, we can talk in more detail here about this in class, is that they basically were put people in the functional fMRI again, play them different types of beats, right? And ask them to keep the beat. And then they basically would stop the music. And while they're in there, I also ask them to keep keeping the beat. And they would see what regions of the brain would light up. And the interesting thing is, this is pretty easy to think about, but what doesn't keep going when she stops the music is any sort of auditory, which would show up generally around here on the sort of lateral sides, right? But you see spots here and here in general. That's the brightest. And if you can remember, right about here is your motor cortex, your primary motor cortex, and this is your sort of secondary motor cortex, right? It's a little more involved in sort of planning of that. So in order to sort of keep playing that song in your head in a way, at least keeping the beat for the song, you are using motor cortex areas to do that, which shows a heavy dependence between motor cortex on music in a way that you might not think about. Right. So we take this one step forward. If we look at actual musical performance, again, they're looking at this premotor area that's right next to the motor cortex, and then this is sort of auditory area. And they show that in people who are trained in music performance, this activity in the premotor cortex, that area right next to the motor cortex, is much greater than those who are not trained to perform music. And they go on to show this a little further, right? If you are really just listening to music, you get a little bit of activity in the premotor cortex, but a much greater amount in the auditory. And then if you're asked to sort of play that song, but without the auditory, without actually hearing the song, then you get a ton of activity in the premotor cortex, which I think is generally to be expected, right? Then that goes along with the other one. So, but you always kind of need both, and that's what this is generally trying to show, is that they're largely thought to be, at least for music performance, there has to be this feedback loop, right? We have to be able to listen to ourselves in order to instruct how to play, right? If all of a sudden that string on your violin becomes slightly out of pitch, you need to know. Or if you're playing in a larger group and somebody starts to speed up, or everybody starts to speed up, well, then you better also speed up, right? And some of those things for people who perform more, is you know that you do that sort of without thinking. And you can see here what they're showing is that your basically auditory cortex is directly interacting with your motor cortex and your premotor cortex, as well as frontal cortex. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. Frontal and prefrontal end up being very important for sort of planning musical motions, and for keeping the beat is largely, we think, sort of stored in more frontal premotor, or frontal and prefrontal cortex. But all of these areas have to work together to perform music. It's not just the physical action of, sliding the bow along the violin strings, right? It's a much more complicated process to actually perform this well. I'm going to put this up here, and I'll encourage you to do these links, but something I would like us to talk about if we have time in class is this idea of how music and emotions can link together, and there's a few other things we can talk about. But here are two links to the same song, one played in the minor key, which is the natural key for this song, and then one played in the major key. And the interesting thing here is, how does that link to emotion? Because generally, everything we hear in minor key, we tend to assign more sad emotions to, whereas if it's in the major key, we assign more happy emotions to. And in the video, the Netflix video you guys will be watching, they also address this. This, however, I do want to make a point. It seems to be, and the video says this too, very much learned through culture. This is not ingrained to us. Previously in class, we've talked a lot about this, because some music majors, it feels so innate to who we are to think that. But there are other cultures who hear things that sound minor key and actually think it's happy. I think Portuguese is one of those, and they'll talk about people from Bali who have very different scales than we do, but they're sort of happy. A scale that a song that sounds very happy to us, because it sort of approximates a major key, is actually like their funeral march, and is actually a very sad song, and that's how we feel. But again, these are things that we have learned through culture, but we've learned them so deeply that they feel real. We can talk about what type of learning this is as well. And also, I do want to make a point, and if I can dig it up in time, we'll talk about it in class on Wednesday. I think I had a couple people on the message board to ask questions about, why do you think music and emotion are so linked? And why do some people, for example, seem more affected by music emotionally? And particularly this has been studied with a concept where some people, in response to music, and I'll admit that I've gotten this occasionally, will get sort of chills from it, right? It's like you can feel it, like in sort of deep inside, that it's really affecting you. And that is, they've studied people who do and don't, and there's literally a stronger connection between your auditory cortex and your limbic system, particularly like amygdala, I believe, in those people. They show that there are physically more axons connecting those two parts of the brain. Right. All right, so I just want to show this briefly to get back to this bigger picture, right? I said that we're moving from the idea to understand how one neuron can translate a signal through an action potential. Now we want to think about how these signals work all the way across the brain, and how the brain is sort of processing information all the time. And the key thing here too is that it takes lots of information going to lots of different places, right? Our brain has lots of highly specialized areas, and that asks them to do their own sorts of computation on them, and then it all comes together to give us sort of the experience we have and to make the decisions we make. And this sort of goes to show what different regions of the brain are responsible for different aspects related to music. So the green dot here is just the basics: acoustic, music, frequency, duration, loudness, right? And that really ends up being this is auditory cortex areas, right? And then some sort of real deep nuclei that are real sort of, inferior colliculus plays a very similar role to the auditory cortex, and so does the thalamus, right? These are just really those signals coming in there, right? Whereas if we look at these high order ones, something like in the red area, music evoked emotions, right? You can see the limbic system lighting up as along with a little bit of the sort of frontal prefrontal cortex. Recognizing music and associated memories, where are you getting? Oh, you're probably getting something like hippocampus, right? Playing and singing, well, where would you expect those? Where we start to see a lot more in the sensory and motor cortex. You may think, why sensory, right? Auditory cortex there, but sensory is very important for a lot of people for performing an instrument, right? You have to be able to literally feel that your bow or that you're pressing the correct frets on a guitar when you're doing this, right? And then again, something like focusing, right? This is going to be a lot of those attention centers that we talked about earlier. So just think of it, something like music is now complex enough, and I would imagine language falls into the same case, that even though we may highlight a few regions, it's really sort of a coordinated whole brain effort to really understand how to do all of this, right? So I think that is all I have for this video. Kept it relatively short. I hope you enjoyed the podcast and the Netflixing that go with this, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Thanks, bye.